The Galactic Concord had spent millennia perfecting diplomacy. Every species followed strict etiquette, carefully structured speech, and ritualized conflict resolution. Wars were rare, because an insult alone could trigger entire star system disputes. In this delicate balance of protocols and tact, the galaxy remained peaceful. And then, humans arrived. With no regard for formality, with no interest in flowery language, and with an uncanny ability to annihilate egos like precision strikes. At first, the galactic community thought humans were just culturally odd. But then, the casualties started. The first incident occurred during a trade dispute between the reptilian Zilari Dominion and the mammalian Orlith Compact. The humans had been asked to mediate. It should have been a standard negotiation. Until Ambassador Richard Holt sat down, listened to both sides argue, sighed loudly and muttered, "God, listening to you two is like watching a pair of drunk pigeons fight over a breadcrumb." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. The Zilari delegation froze, their scales turning a dull gray, a sign of extreme stress. The Orlith ambassador made a strangled choking sound and immediately collapsed. Medics were called. The session was adjourned. And Ambassador Holt? He just blinked. What? What did I say? Within days, the Galactic Concord Assembly was in chaos. The Orlith ambassador was recovering, but only barely. The Zilari delegation filed a formal complaint, claiming they had suffered emotional trauma. A special subcommittee was formed to determine whether humans had violated galactic diplomatic protocols, whether the statement constituted an act of aggression, and most importantly, how much damage could human insults actually do? The results of the investigation would shock the galaxy, because it wasn't just the Zilari and Orlith. Reports started flooding in. A Drelthi ambassador suffered an aneurysm after being called a walking traffic cone. A Zirak warlord abandoned negotiations after a human sarcastically asked if his military was run by unpaid interns. The Supreme Chancellor of the Threxan Union resigned after being told his forehead looked like a rejected topographical map. The conclusion was unavoidable. Human mockery was a weapon, and the galactic community was completely unprepared for it. The Galactic Concord had dealt with wars, plagues, and existential threats. They had survived rogue AI uprisings, planetary cataclysms, and even an attempted coup by sentient fungus. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for human sarcasm. Because this wasn't just a diplomatic issue anymore. This was a public health crisis. Alien officials were collapsing under stress. Rulers were resigning. Entire species were reconsidering their place in the universe. And so, the Galactic High Court was summoned for an emergency hearing. The charge? Determining if human mockery constituted an illegal weapon of mass destruction. Inside the Grand Hall of Galactic Justice, representatives from 37 civilizations gathered. The case was presented. The evidence was overwhelming. A holographic screen displayed dozens of reports detailing severe diplomatic breakdowns, psychological trauma, and even hospitalizations, all caused by human verbal aggression. One Zilari delegate had to be wheeled into the courtroom in a stress pod after an Earth representative told him, "You look like an undercooked chicken nugget." The prosecution was led by Magistrate Clyer, an elder statesman of the Zirak Dominion. He stood before the court, his voice grave. "We have allowed humans to participate in our diplomatic process under the assumption that they would adhere to intergalactic decorum." His reptilian eyes narrowed. Instead, they have introduced psychological warfare. The crowd murmured in uneasy agreement. Ambassador Richard Holt, representing humanity, leaned back in his chair and sighed. Then, in a deliberately slow voice, he asked, "Your Honor, are you seriously suggesting that words, just words, are as dangerous as actual weapons?" Magistrate Clear pointed dramatically to the evidence screen. "Ambassador Holt, the Supreme Minister of the Orlith Compact was hospitalized for 3 days after you referred to his economic plan as the strategic equivalent of putting all your money in a sock and hoping for the best. Holt blinked, then suppressed a smirk. The Orlith delegation visibly tensed at the memory. Magistrate Clier continued, "And let us not forget the case of Grand Warlord Zorvax of the Threxan Union, who abdicated his throne after a human diplomat asked if his military uniforms were designed by an angry toddler with a glue gun." A hushed silence fell over the room. Then Holt sighed again, rubbing his temples. "Okay, look, if these people can't handle a little constructive criticism, maybe they shouldn't be running entire civilizations." Gasps. A Threxan dignitary fainted. Magistrate Clier slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Holt looked around at the scandalized faces. Then, ever so slightly, he smirked, because this was going to be fun. As the trial progressed, scientists across the galaxy conducted studies on the effects of human mockery. The results were undeniable. Humans processed conflict differently. They thrived in verbal combat. What should have been psychological trauma only made them stronger. In fact, some studies suggested that humans actively enjoyed frustrating their opponents. They weren't just immune to insults, they had weaponized them. This was no longer just a diplomatic issue. This was a security threat, and the galaxy had to figure out how to contain it, before it was too late. The Galactic High Court was in chaos. Every attempt to prove human sarcasm wasn't dangerous had backfired spectacularly. Several witnesses had to be escorted out in medical pods after attempting to relive their experiences with human insults. A legal aide from the Xerac Dominion suffered a full-blown existential crisis after hearing an offhanded human remark. "Buddy, I've seen sentient AI with a better sense of humor than you." And worst of all, the human ambassador was enjoying this. Ambassador Richard Holt had been granted permission to defend his species. That was their second mistake, because their first mistake had been underestimating him. Richard Holt stood before the court, looking completely unfazed. Across from him, Magistrate Clier was visibly frustrated. "Ambassador Holt," the magistrate began, voice strained, "are you or are you not aware that your species has caused widespread mental and emotional distress across the galactic community?" Holt scratched his chin, considering. "I mean, we were aware people were getting weirdly upset, but in our defense that's kind of a you problem." Gasps. An insectoid diplomat choked on their own mandibles. Clier's frills flared with pure, barely contained outrage. "A you problem?" Holt shrugged. "Look, if someone has a breakdown because we called their economic plan hot garbage on wheels, maybe they shouldn't be in charge of a civilization, you know?" The Grand Minister of the Zalari Dominion turned an alarming shade of gray. An aide rushed forward with a cooling spray. Magistrate Clier banged his gavel repeatedly. "Ambassador, you are not helping your case." Holt raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because you guys seem real close to declaring sarcasm a war crime, and I kinda want to see where that goes." As the trial continued, the Galactic Concord Science Division released its official findings on the effects of human mockery. The report was devastating. Key findings. 1. Non-human species suffered extreme stress reactions when exposed to prolonged human sarcasm. 2. Insults from humans could trigger physical symptoms, including dizziness, nausea, and, in rare cases, loss of consciousness. 3. Humans, when insulted, experienced the opposite reaction: increased mental clarity and enhanced performance. This meant that humans didn't just tolerate verbal combat, they thrived in it. What was psychological damage to everyone else was a sport to them, and that was terrifying. The Galactic Concord had faced warlords, planet-destroying superweapons, and existential threats before, but never had they encountered an enemy who could literally talk them to death. The reality was inescapable. Human mockery wasn't just dangerous, it was a biological weapon. The court was dead silent as the lead magistrate took his seat. Magistrate Clear looked pale and exhausted. "This court," he began, voice weak, "finds that humanity's unique method of verbal engagement presents a significant risk to the stability of intergalactic relations." There was murmuring. Clear cleared his throat and spoke the final ruling. "Henceforth, human sarcasm, mockery, and pointed verbal assaults are to be considered an unregulated weapon under galactic law." Stunned silence. Holt blinked. "Did you guys just declare that our sense of humor is an actual weapon?" Clear rubbed his temples. "Yes." A slow, mischievous smile spread across Holt's face. "So you're saying we're officially too dangerous to be insulted?" Clear's eye twitched. Just get out of my courtroom." Holt turned on his heel, whistling. Because today, humanity had won a war without firing a single shot. The Galactic High Court's ruling spread like wildfire across the known universe. For the first time in recorded history, an entire form of communication had been classified as a weapon. Not because it transmitted harmful frequencies, not because it contained subliminal messaging, but because humans were just too damn good at roasting people alive, verbally. Governments scrambled to adjust. Security forces updated training manuals to include human verbal containment strategies. Some species implemented emergency procedures, instructing officials to politely exit conversations if a human so much as raised an eyebrow in a sarcastic manner. And worst of all, the humans were thriving. They had just been handed the greatest diplomatic loophole in galactic history. Because now, every time a human delivered an insult, it wasn't just mockery. It was an act of strategic warfare. Within weeks, the effects of the ruling were felt everywhere. Case number 1, the Zilari Summit disaster. A human delegate referred to a Zilari official's military budget as the financial equivalent of setting your credits on fire and hoping for the best. The Zilari delegation collapsed into full-scale economic panic. The planetary stock market dropped 14% overnight. Case number 2, the Threxan civil unrest. A human journalist described the Threxan ruler's policy on planetary defense as like leaving your front door open and hoping burglars are allergic to doorknobs. The entire administration collapsed within 3 days. Case number 3, the Zirak Empire's military breakdown. A human admiral referred to a Zirak fleet strategy as the space equivalent of bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. The entire high command resigned out of embarrassment. At this point, it wasn't just diplomacy falling apart. It was entire civilizations, and humanity knew it. While most species panicked, the humans adapted. And by adapted, they fully embraced their new status as an existential threat. The Terran coalition quietly formed a new diplomatic branch, the Office of Strategic Verbal Engagement. Their official mission? To ensure peaceful relations across the galaxy. Their actual mission? To annoy enemy governments into submission. Verbal combat specialists were recruited. Linguists were trained in psychological warfare through sarcasm. Human ambassadors were given extra funding to hone their precision insult techniques. By the time the other galactic governments realized what was happening, it was already too late. Desperate to reassert their dignity, the Zirak Dominion attempted to create an anti-human response unit. A team of elite diplomats was trained in what they believed to be counter-insult strategies. They called it Project Verbal Shield. Their goal? To develop resistance to human sarcasm. Their method? Simulated verbal attacks. In a classified training facility, Zirak officials spent weeks exposing themselves to pre-recorded human insults. At first, the results were promising. They were able to endure low-level comments such as, "Wow, that's an interesting strategy. Did you learn that from a cereal box?" And, "Oh, you're in charge? That's adorable." But then they reached Phase 3. They attempted to withstand a live simulation featuring an actual human, and within 45 seconds, the entire program collapsed. A single sarcastic remark from a human diplomat, "You guys are really trying your best, huh?" caused 3 Xerox officials to resign, 2 to experience cardiac stress reactions, and 1 to defect to the humans out of sheer humiliation. The program was shut down permanently, and the Xerox officially banned all attempts to match human verbal aggression. The war of words was over. Humanity had won. The Galactic Concord had always believed that words were the foundation of peace, that negotiation and careful speech could prevent war, that civilizations could resolve conflicts through dialogue. They were wrong, because humans had turned dialogue into a battlefield. And the galaxy? The galaxy had lost. In an emergency session, every major civilization gathered at the Galactic Concord to determine how to survive this new reality. Representatives sat in tense silence, their expressions grim. At the head of the table sat Ambassador Richard Holt, looking completely relaxed. He was the problem. And yet, he was smiling. Magistrate Clyer, now visibly aged by the stress of dealing with humans, stood up and addressed the room. After extensive debate, Clyer began, voice strained, the Galactic Concord has decided that human verbal engagement techniques pose a direct risk to interstellar stability. He took a deep breath. Therefore, we propose the following treaty. The room tensed. A holographic document appeared on the screen. The Interstellar Agreement of Diplomatic Self-Preservation, also known as the Please for the Love of the Stars, Stop Talking. Treaty Article 1. Humanity is forbidden from using sarcasm, mockery, or pointed verbal barbs in formal diplomatic settings. Article 2. Any human representative who delivers an insult resulting in hospitalization or mental collapse will be charged with unlawful deployment of a weaponized statement. Article 3. All alien governments reserve the right to immediately end discussions if human dialogue reaches a Category 3 threat level of snark. Article 4. If a human ambassador is found guilty of repeated sarcasm-based offenses, they may be barred from diplomatic service and reassigned to human-only territories. Article 5. The Terran Coalition is strictly prohibited from developing sarcasm into a formalized military strategy. As Ambassador Holt read the treaty, he let out a low whistle. Wow, he muttered. You guys really went all out on this. A Xeric diplomat winced, physically recoiling as if the words had stabbed him in the chest. Holt grinned. Then he turned to the human delegation. Well, what do you guys think? Should we sign it? The Terran representatives exchanged glances. Then, in perfect unison, they burst out laughing. The Galactic Concord representatives paled. Clear's frills flared in sheer panic. Ambassador Holt. Holt wiped a tear from his eye, still chuckling. Oh man, you guys actually thought we'd stop? More gasps. A Threxan minister fainted. Holt leaned forward, eyes twinkling with pure, unfiltered chaos. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, you just made us signing insults into an officially recognized war crime. He grinned. Do you have any idea how much fun that's going to be for us? Despite the treaty, the damage was already done. Humanity had not only survived the trial, they had cemented themselves as the single most dangerous verbal combatants in the galaxy. No alien government could risk negotiating directly with them. Every diplomatic summit now included a human containment policy, where alien leaders were advised not to engage in direct debate. Alien academies rewrote entire sections of political science textbooks, adding, Rule number 1, do not argue with a human. You will lose. The Terran Coalition, meanwhile? They exploited the loopholes immediately. Human corporations started hiring insult consultants to legally bankrupt alien competitors. The military developed tactical sarcasm drills. And in political negotiations, human diplomats realized they didn't even have to make demands. All they had to do was look mildly unimpressed, and their enemies would surrender out of sheer emotional exhaustion. As the summit ended, Magistrate Clear approached Holt one last time. His expression was hollow. "You've ruined us," Clear muttered. Holt shrugged. "We warned you." Clear rubbed his temples. "So what happens now?" Holt grinned. "Well, I think we all learned a valuable lesson today." He clapped Clear on the shoulder. "Next time you meet a human diplomat, maybe don't insult them first." And with that, Holt walked away, whistling, leaving the galaxy forever changed.